From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Brian McCornack will have the latest on sugarcane aphid activity in grain sorghum. This pest now confirmed in 3 counties in Kansas. The good news, says Brian, is that the aphid is showing up later than it has in previous years, which may play to the advantage of you growers. Then K-State's Mykel Taylor goes over the university's new analysis of 2 proposed changes to the federal crop insurance program and what those would mean for all producers who utilize crop insurance. And further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee looks at a new study of bird collisions with windows as influenced by the structure and location of buildings. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Well, you grain sorghum growers over the past few growing seasons have become acquainted with the sugarcane aphid, a pest which has developed into a real worry when it ramps up its numbers and goes after grain sorghum here in the Central Plains. We're going to get a status report on this pest now. Joining us is Brian McCornack. He is a research entomologist at K-State and one of the team of entomologists who's keeping an eye on this pest. Just some background here. It debuted, 3 years ago? Is that right, Brian, the sugarcane aphid?
Yeah, our first report was in 2014, so it was about late August is when we found them in Sedgwick County. It was actually a county agent that reported on a grower field, so we went and made the look, and sure enough, it was sugarcane aphid, and that was our first report. And then after that, I think most growers are familiar with 2015 and 2016, how much yield loss we can really receive from having one new aphid in the landscape. Several folks even planted something different because they're worried about potential losses from this pest this year. Mm-hmm. You know, like you said, we've got boots on the ground. We've got extension specialists in our department, so Jeff Whitworth, J.P. Michaud, Sarah Zukoff, all working with extension agents and crop consultants, really looking for any sorghum that we can and what's in it to get the word out. Really the best way to management is to scout early, scout often, and know before you spray. And right now we're in the scout early. We did have one report about 3 weeks ago in Cowley County. It was about 10 days or so later than we first saw it last year. But the major difference is the size of the population. It really took a long time for the team to find a plant that had aphids on it, but there was a winged adult that had a few babies next to it. That was about it. Versus, this time last year, we could easily find a sorghum field that had, treatable populations in it. So they're here, but they're really, really, really low numbers.
That's really the good news at the moment.
That's great news, absolutely, yep. And so we'll kind of give you a status update as we've got 2 additional counties that were added. And these are all added to the sugarcane aphid map. We've got contributors all the way from Texas to Oklahoma to Kansas as part of a USDA ARS project to actually monitor it. So as you know, knowing when this is in the field is the first step to taking some management actions. And so we've got 2 more counties to report, and that's on the MyFields map. So all you have to do is go to myfields.info. There's a link there that says Sugarcane Aphid Distribution Map. It's pretty easy to get to it to see where it is currently. But the 2 new counties are Ford and Sedgwick. So Ford is definitely more western part of the state. And then really no surprise is to have Sedgwick and Cowley County are the 2 that are more south central. That's where we've had this aphid in the past.
And Cowley County had been reported earlier.
Yeah, that was the first report. Yeah, and so it looks like it is slowly progressing north, which is not too surprising. That's typically how this works, how the migration pattern works. And if you look at the map, you'll see 2 trails essentially for the sugarcane aphid. It starts in the South Texas and moves its way up, and so you've got kind of 2 clear paths if you look at the map. And it's, I guess, no surprise that it's in Ford, at least on the western part of the state, and we've got now 2 in the south central part.
not to look a gift horse in the mouth, but any idea as to why it's of a lesser concern, or at least a later concern, this year compared to, say, last year?
Yeah, it'd be really nice to have these predictive abilities, months ago. But at least looking at how this is being managed in the South, that's really, I think, the first big success is working with growers to say, plant a resistant variety. Here's a known list of varieties. Working with United Sorghum Checkoff, Brent Bean and his group, and others from Texas AgriLife to Oklahoma State, those that have at least tested some of these hybrids and replicated trials, to show that there's some level of resistance where the sugarcane aphid populations and other aphid populations are generally lower in these. And so that's really the first line of defense is preventative. So put a plant out there that has some resistance to aphids in it. When we really start to slow those populations down, there's fewer of those aphids to get up into the jet stream and move north on a rain event. Again, they don't overwinter in Kansas, so we're relying on those populations south of us to infest our fields. So the good news is when you manage this from an area-wide approach, so doing good management practices in south central Texas all the way up, by the time it gets here, populations are much slower. Mm-hmm. Now, this is also sugarcane aphid. So we can easily see some hot spots or pockets pop up. So, of the counties that we have, the one field that was located in Ford County, had more we call a hot spot where populations were a little bit bigger, but for the most part, it wasn't a widespread issue. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those where, the scout often part is very important, where once you found it, making sure that you stay on top of it, watching how quickly the population grows. Yeah. And to your knowledge, have growers committed to hybrids that do have some resistance level? Can you tell at all, Brian? It's a great question, and we don't have a formal survey out during this part of the year, but during the sorghum schools, that's one of those things that we try to get some information on from those that participate in the survey. Is what did you grow? And the other great piece that we're working on this year, from a collaborative standpoint, is between J.P. Michaud, Sarah Zukoff, and myself. We've got replicated hybrid performance trials in 4 locations across the state. Actually, I should take that back. There's 5 locations. So if aphids don't hit, that doesn't really mean a whole lot to the growers that are looking for the data. But if aphids do hit in some of those locations, we're testing those commercially available hybrids to get a better understanding of how well that resistance holds up to sugarcane aphids. And we think that's a pretty valuable piece. But as far as who's planting it, that's one of those we won't really know until after the fact. But those are the types of data we're interested in.
What is key, though, in those areas where it's turning up or may still turn up, the planting date for that sorghum can make a definite difference in as far as its vulnerability.
Yeah, vulnerability has a lot to do with the growth stage in which it's infested. So if your sorghum crop is, probably pre-boot or early flower, and you're hitting 50 to 125 aphids per plant, you're at a threshold where if you don't do something, you're going to lose yield. So if you think about your early dates, if you planted well before June, most of those are past flowering. I'm guessing most of those are probably into soft to hard dough, depending on planting date. And if you're just getting infested, you're essentially past that major window of vulnerability to yield loss. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean you can't have stand issues and lodging and sticky heads later. That doesn't mean you just completely walk away until harvest. It just means that the likelihood for loss due to sugarcane aphid feeding is much less once you get past that hard dough stage. Mm-hmm. Now, if you came in with a late planting, something that followed wheat, for example, you're going to want to be a little bit more diligent in your sampling efforts for the late planted. So, what we see in this landscape across Kansas is this it's a mosaic of different planting dates and flowering times. You can even get that within a field depending on some of the moisture availability and stresses that are there. So, again, target those that are more likely for yield loss. In this case, it would be the late planted. Anything that would be in the probably boot, early differentiation into that reproductive stages. Anything that's at pre-flower to milk stage. It's going to be the more vulnerable stage, more vulnerable crops.
And so, to remind what producers need to look for as signs that sugarcane aphid has arrived, what would be the first indicator?
So the easiest thing is to spot honeydew. And that can be tricky, especially if it's a really early infestation, is that if they just got there, you're not going to see these little droplets of honeydew, and they're sticky. So if you go out early in the morning, you'll get some dew on the leaves, and a lot of times those two can look the same. But if you get there maybe a little after 10 or so when the dew's dried off, you'll still see these little droplets. And you can easily see it by walking through the fields, looking for leaves. The best way to see the aphids, though, is to lift the leaf up that's just above that spot of honeydew, and that's where you can see the aphids. The reason why I say that is just because it's honeydew doesn't mean it's sugarcane aphid.
Okay.
there are other aphid species that could be causing those same symptoms, but it's a good place to start, at least to identify.
And then the physical appearance of the aphid itself.
Yeah. And so if it's in the world, it's a good chance it's going to be cornleaf aphid. If it's on the bottom side of the leaf towards the base of the plant, there's yellow sugarcane aphid. It's going to be similar to sugarcane aphid. They're different species, but it's got fine hairs all over its body and looks more like a pineapple. So you do need a hand lens to see the differences between some of these species. And then you also see green bug out there, which has more of that green racing stripe down the center of the abdomen. But then sugarcane aphid is going to be more that pale white to sometimes yellow. It's not going to have those fine hairs, and it's going to have those dark cornicles or the tailpipes, and then the dark tarsi or feet.
And you probably have a photo of sugarcane aphid on MyFields.
Yep. Myfields.info is a great place to find that.
Very good. But the point here is that producers should be scouting, particularly if they have grain sorghum fields in or in the general vicinity of those three counties, again, Ford, Sedgwick, and Cowley, and combine that with what they can track as far as further confirmations of sugarcane aphid elsewhere in the state that you post regularly, you say, updated on myfields.info. They can keep on top of this.
Yep. As soon as we get a call, we confirm it. We get some pictures to make sure that's the aphid we're looking for before it goes into the map that's shared with everybody. GPS and all that's not shared. It's just at a county level. But that county level information is really important for us to send out alerts and notifications through the myfields.info platform. So if you're not a registered user on that platform, it's a free account. Tell us what state and county you're in. And then when we send out a new alert that a new county has been added, you'd receive an email notification saying, "Here's the county. Here's what we saw. Here's some management actions that might follow up." But at this point, it's really, like I said, that scout early, scout off, and know before you spray. We're in that first part, which is scout early.
So far, so good.
So far, so good.
Not to rest on our laurels here, but sugarcane aphid has been identified in 3 counties in Kansas. Hopefully it will be restricted to not very many more than that anyway, Brian. So appreciate your time right here.
Great, thank you.
He's Brian McCornack, crop entomologist, Kansas State University, keeping tabs on the progression of sugarcane aphid in grain sorghum here in Kansas. Do make full use of that resource that has all of the information handy to you at myfields.info, myfields.info. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today.
Man, it's hot out here. Heat stress affects more than just humans. It also affects livestock. Extreme heat, humidity, wind speeds, and cloud cover all make a difference in air temperature. To control problems, make sure your livestock have shade and water provided at all times. This will help prevent problems in breeding, meat production, and reduce chances of death. Please take all these into consideration for livestock production. Brought to you by K-State Animal Science Leadership Academy participants.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today, and we want to pass along on this segment more information that was shared with the audience at the recent Risk and Profit Conference at Kansas State University, hosted once more by the Department of Agricultural Economics. There was a session on proposed changes to the federal crop insurance program as part of the 2018 Farm Bill dialogue. Now, we're not that far down the road on that process yet, but what's being said about crop insurance has garnered more than a little bit of attention. Those who have been looking at it from an analytical point of view include our guest now, Mykel Taylor, agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension. She talked about this at Risk and Profit. And the thought here is that this is a major issue for virtually all of crop production in Kansas and the United States, Mykel.
Yes. I mean, any changes to crop insurance can have some pretty far-reaching effects. So it's of interest to know, even at this relatively early stage of talking about the Farm Bill, what might come under consideration for changes and, taking the time to look at those and seeing what kind of consequences it would have.
And you and your colleagues, including Art Barnaby, have done just that on several points that have been forwarded out there. One of those is a cap on participation based on adjusted gross income of an operation. What is actually being considered there?
So there's two different caps that are being considered. One under the AFFIRM Act is a $250,000 adjusted gross income or AGI cap, and then the other one that's in the administration's budget is a higher cap at $500,000. So basically what we know about that is if a farm has an AGI above one of those two thresholds, then they wouldn't be able to participate in crop insurance in that year. Now that threshold might be a 3-year average or some kind of rolling average, but we just know that it's going to create a threshold for income above which any farm that hits that is not going to then be able to participate in crop insurance for a period of time.
But what you and colleagues here did was take a look at just what the implementation of one of those caps would mean as far as insurance participation, right?
Right. So what we looked at was basically saying, okay, if we capped participation based on AGI, what would that do to the percent of farms that would be able to participate? And the interesting thing is that, well, we know that AGI fluctuates from year to year. So if it's a good year and we've had really high profitability in the sector like we did in 11, 12, and 13, well, then you can have between 30 and 40% of Kansas farms that would be affected by that cap.
This is based on Kansas Farm Management Association data, correct?
Yes, it is. And then taking that same data and looking at years like 2015 and 2016, well, then that drops to only 5 to 10% of the farms that would be affected. But in either case, you're going to be lopping off these upper earning farms.
And what does that mean? That resonates a little deeper than a lot of folks realize, you say.
Well, the other thing that we looked at was what does it do to the underlying risk pool? If you take out these high-earning farms, does it change the riskiness of the pool of farms that then are being included in the crop insurance program? And the short answer to that is yes. It will make the underlying risk pool riskier, which means that premiums will go up for everybody that's left in the pool. So there's implications for you, even if you're not one of the farms to get taken out of the program because of your AGI, you could end up in a riskier pool that has to be insured, and then the premiums go up. The other thing that is possible to happen is that farms and farmers are going to try to work around these types of limitations by creating more farms, paperwork-wise. But it's still a matter of tracking each of these farms and their adjusted gross income every year and who can and can't participate. And that in and of itself is going to have some administrative costs, both for RMA and for the producers themselves.
And all of this falls under the heading of unintended consequences.
It does. I mean, it's just important to know that even if you're not one of the farms that gets eliminated from participation, it could still affect you through your premiums.
And that is regardless of which of these two caps we're talking about, the $500,000, $250,000, same principle applies here.
Same principle applies. If it's the $250,000 cap, you're just cutting off that many more farms, which changes the risk pool just a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So you might have just that much bigger of an impact on premiums.
So that is one of the changes that's being considered, and what KFMA data is saying about the end result of such a cap based on, again, adjusted gross income. Then there's talk, which we've heard quite some time now, Michael, and that is regarding premium subsidies and capping those, the cost share that farmers and the federal government enter into in supporting insurance.
Right. So this particular proposal that's out there is basically saying, look, right now producers are getting about a 60% discount on every dollar of coverage that they buy. So we're going to limit that to only $40,000 in cost share coming from the government. And then what would happen is any coverage that a producer would buy beyond that $40,000, they would pay full price for it. So they would lose their 60% discount and they would pay dollar for anything. So it doesn't limit your ability to be in the program, but it definitely changes the cost if you hit that $40,000 subsidy cap.
And so you analyzed this in a similar manner to see what the impact would be?
Sure. So this is where Art and I looked at the number of acres that it would take to hit that cap. And so in 2016 in Kansas, it's just shy of 2,000 acres. In other words, you could insure about 2,000 acres in Kansas in 2016 before you hit that $40,000 subsidy cap. But then any acres that you want to insure beyond that 2,000, that's going to cost you full dollar for dollar. The interesting thing there is that that 2,000 acre cap changes every year. So this is similar to the other proposal, where in years where we are insuring a high-value crop, like in 2011, 12, and 13, in those cases, you only make it to about 1,500 acres. And then you've hit the subsidy cap, and you have to pay full price for all the coverage you would get beyond that. So it's going to fluctuate year to year as to how many acres you could insure with the cost share from the government, and then how much you would have to pay for full price. And in most cases, we figure that people won't pay full price for that crop insurance. In that case, we're going to see between 20 and 30% of farms hitting that cap and having to decide how they're going to allocate their crop insurance dollars. I've got my, say, 2,000 acres, but my farm is 5,000 acres. Which acres am I going to insure? And the logical answer to that is I'm going to insure my riskiest acres. So if that's your corn crop and you insure your corn crop and you don't insure your wheat or you don't insure your beans, well, that follows through the same result that was on the AGI cap. Mm-hmm. You now have a risk pool of people who are insuring their riskiest crops. So the riskiness of the pool increases, therefore the premiums increase for everybody that's left in the pool. So even if you're not affected directly by this $40,000 subsidy cap, you could be affected indirectly by the riskiness of the pool going up and therefore the premiums going up.
And once more, results that were not anticipated were not really the basis of these proposed changes at all.
Right. I mean, these changes on the surface seem like they're targeting a very specific group of producers, high-earning, large-scale farms. And they do that, but because of the nature of the insurance industry, it has ramifications then for everybody that's left in the pool.
When you presented the information at Risk and Profit Conference, it likely generated considerable dialogue and discussion. It's still very much up in the air whether these will ever see the light of day, but they are to be taken seriously, aren't they?
I think at this point, any considerations that are coming up looking at crop insurance need to be taken seriously. We listened to our guest speaker, Matt Erickson. He's the chief economist for the Senate Ag Committee, and his take-home point was that there's a lot of things being asked for. There's a limited number of resources, and so some tough decisions are going to be made, and there's no reason to think that crop insurance isn't on that list of things that could have some tough decisions made. Whether it's exactly these proposals that we're talking about here today or some other version, I think we just need to keep in mind that any proposal that comes up that's looking to change crop insurance, there's probably more to it than what's just on the surface.
So in other words, producers shouldn't just assume that crop insurance will be held harmless. There's a lot of give and take going here.
Right. I mean, I would anticipate there's going to be a lot of tough decisions being made and that there's going to be a lot of debate. So hopefully crop insurance will, come out unscathed. But again, we just need to pay attention so we can be aware of what's being discussed and what those ramifications are.
Well, the kind of analysis that you and Art Barnaby of K-State have put together will add to good discussion on what might happen here. This is posted on the agmanager.info website, is it not?
Yes, it is, along with all the other presentations from the Risk and Profit Conference.
So be sure to check that out, and you're looking for by title, Crop Insurance and the Next Farm Bill. That was the presentation that Mykel and Art Barnaby offered up to the Risk and Profit audience, and it's really good work and important information to have in pocket as we consider the future of the crop insurance program. Mykel, thank you for coming over and sharing these notes. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Happy to do it.
Research and Extension Agricultural Economist at K-State, Mykel Taylor. Once more, she was one of those presenting this analysis of the potential restrictions on crop insurance and what they might mean to the overall coverage available to producers. That at the Risk and Profit Conference last week here at K-State, and you're listening to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever wondered why livestock producers burn Kansas pasture? Here's the deal. Controlled burning helps preserve the prairie and allows every bite feeder cattle eat to be the most nutritious. National Wildlife and Parks also feel it is a necessity to help with wildlife populations.
So the next time you see a Kansas pasture burning, know it's for the good of our wildlife, our prairie, and our livestock. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you as we turn now to today's agricultural news page and these headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. For this week's Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report from the USDA for the week ending last Sunday, topsoil moisture supplies in Kansas are at 3% surplus and 66% adequate, 31% short to very short, while subsoil moisture is at 2% surplus and 70% adequate, 28% short to very short. The Kansas corn crop is rated this week at 57% good to excellent, 29% fair, and 14% poor to very poor. Corn in the dough stage now at 83%. That's near the 5-year average. In the dent at 40%. That's somewhat behind the 46% average for the day. The condition of the Kansas soybean crop then, 55% good to excellent, 35% fair, and 10% poor to very poor. Soybeans now blooming, 95%. That's ahead of the 90% average. And soybean setting pods at 79%, ahead of the 66% average for this date. Grain sorghum rated at 62% good to excellent, 31% fair, 7% poor to very poor. Sorghum now headed, 79%, near the average, and sorghum coloring at 11%. That's behind the 20% average. Third cutting of alfalfa, 92% complete. That's well ahead of the 81% average. And the fourth cutting, 24% in, again ahead of the 17% average. Range and pasture conditions are at 56% good to excellent, 33% fair, 11% called poor to very poor, while stock water supplies 1% surplus and 87% adequate with 12% short to very short. Those are the Kansas crop conditions as of this past weekend from the USDA. For this national row crop condition update, we turn now to the USDA's Gary Crawford.
This is one of those years in which the condition reports for most crops are pretty similar, the only exception, spring wheat. But USDA meteorologist Mike Brouk gave us the latest on the other crops as we started this week.
Corn percent good to excellent was 62 as of August 20th. Soybeans was 60%. And sorghum was 66% good to excellent.
The notable exception to the 60s is spring wheat, only 34% of that crop in good to excellent shape. That's 1% better than last week.
But, again, last year was 66%, so it's really not comparable to last year because of the drought that they've had in Montana and the Dakotas this year.
Those areas did get some rain over this past week.
But overall, I don't think that it's come in time to significantly improve yield prospects.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Here's one last reminder about K-State's Agronomy Field Day taking place at the Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. That is set for tomorrow morning and starting at around 9 o'clock with registration. The program itself will begin at 9:30. A complimentary lunch will be served, and they put together another fine lineup of subjects, including field tours, looking at occasional tillage in long-term no-till systems, and a look at the management of sugarcane aphid in grain sorghum. The indoor presentations will include sorghum early planting, some perspectives and challenges, managing Palmer amaranth in corn and sorghum, crop selection considerations for West Central Kansas, sorghum versus corn versus soybeans, the economic returns in these challenging markets, and a look at selection of wheat varieties, lessons we learned from the 2017 harvest. Again, that's at K-State's Fall Field Day, the row crop roundup, as they're calling it, at the Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. Registration at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The program starts at 9:30. And again, the center, as you well know, located just to the south of Hayes, just off of U.S. Highway 183. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Now for you dairy producers, this week's edition of Milk Lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I went to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning their supply of alfalfa and what they might be doing in terms of purchases this fall or into the winter to cover the rest of the feeding season. We've had some really wonderful weather here the last few weeks, and we've gotten some rain across all of the state. And we may get some more in the coming weeks before we take the last cutting of alfalfa. Right now, as we look at alfalfa prices across the state, we actually have some pretty decent buys out there. Much of the state, the cost is running about 0.7 to 0.85 cents per point of relative feed value. So compared to some recent years, we've actually got some pretty good buys out there. And the supply is fairly great in most places, so should have the opportunity, at least from the buyer's perspective, to be able to purchase feed at a more reasonable price than maybe what we've had in the past. So here are some things I'd like you to think about as you think about what you're going to be feeding your animals for the next, say, 8 to 10 months. How are you actually sitting on your supply of hay? Are you going to have to purchase some hay during that time? If you're going to have to be purchasing some hay during that time, you might want to sit down with your feed advisor, try to figure out about what you might be short, and start making plans to buy that. Maybe you buy all of it now, or maybe you buy just a portion of it, and you wait a little bit, see what prices do. We probably will have a fairly nice fourth cutting, and maybe in some instances there might be at least a short fifth cutting right before frost. So there should be some more supply added to our current supply, which may actually give us some additional opportunities to buy, maybe not at a cheaper price, but maybe at a higher quality. And that's really one of the things I'd like you to think about. As we look at alfalfa quality, we know that cattle generally do respond, at least in terms of milk production, to feeding of higher quality alfalfa. So with a softer price than what maybe what we've seen in other years, at least more recently, do you have the opportunity to buy maybe better hay than what you actually have in the barn currently, and transfer some of that lower quality hay maybe that you harvested on your farm this summer to some of your other classes of livestock, allowing you to feed higher quality hay to your lactating cows? Especially your early lactation cows are high-producing animals, again, with the thought of trying to achieve a greater level of milk production out of those animals, keeping in mind that 1 or 2 pounds of increased milk production can go a long way in paying for the cost of that hay. So, some things I want you to encourage you to do as a dairy farmer: sit down with your feed advisor and try to determine if you do need to purchase some alfalfa, or if we have some alfalfa on the farm, maybe isn't of greater quality, and we have an opportunity to buy in at a reasonable price that will help increase the production of our herd, as well as increase the money that we might have in our checking account at the end of the day. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take into consideration where they currently are when their alfalfa supply and what they will need to get through the next 8 to 10 months.
All right, Mike, many thanks. Well, our weekly conversation with K-State's Charlie Lee is next here on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today returns now, as does wildlife specialist K-State Research and Extension Charlie Lee for his weekly look at wildlife management. In the spotlight this week, bird collisions with windows, Charlie, and hardly an infrequent occurrence. And as we look at the record, there are lots of bird losses associated with this.
There's been estimates of the annual bird mortality from collisions with buildings and windows has been estimated to be about 1 billion birds each year in North America. There's lots of different bird species that are affected by these bird-building collisions, including species of conservation concern. Oftentimes, it's the birds that are flying during the nighttime that are known to strike windows in large cities after they become attracted to and then disoriented by the artificial lighting, or when there's low cloud cover, forces individual birds or even flocks of birds to fly at altitudes that are below the top of many of the skyscrapers. But during the daytime hours, birds also strike windows after mistaking the reflected environment in that glass for a habitat or an open space where they think they can escape. So window collision risk is related to lots of different factors, but primarily it's the structural features of the buildings and then the land cover features in the environment immediately surrounding those buildings.
And that is starting to get into the theme of this research, which we want to delve into a little deeper. Are there certain species by name that are more prone to collisions?
Yes, in this particular study, they found 324 bird carcasses, and 275 of those carcasses were able to be identified as to species. The mortality was widespread across several of the species, including common yellowthroat, ovenbirds, ruby-throated hummingbirds, but mortality was highest in the migrant species. There was 91% of the birds that they collected were from migrants compared to resident birds. That was only at a 9% rate. So 99% of them were passerine birds or near passerine species like doves and hummingbirds. So yes, there are certainly some very common species out there that are certainly impacted by collisions with windows.
This study particularly was interested in the effect of the structure of the building itself and whether or not that encourages these collisions, right?
Right. They monitored buildings, and they used 150 university students at 40 different universities in 2014, which included searching around 281 different buildings for bird carcasses. They wanted to look for monitored buildings that varied in size and different land cover types immediately surrounding those buildings, and then also looked at various locations, whether they were more close to be in urban environments or in a more of a rural environment situation. They had a very rigid protocol with university professors outlining the methodology for the search protocol. The students then followed that protocol. Their criteria for selecting small buildings was something 1 to a 2-story single-family residence. Medium buildings was from 2 to 4 stories in height, and large buildings were buildings that were greater than 5 stories in height. Then they used Google Earth imagery to estimate the percent of vegetation that's surrounding those study buildings within 50 yards, and they made sure that the buildings were separated by at least 100 yards in order to reduce some of the statistical variance.
And the findings that resulted from this research, did they clarify what sort of building structures would be most likely to lead to these collisions?
Well, the building size has a strong positive effect on bird window collision mortalities, but really the strength of this particular study showed that the effect of the mortality depend upon regional urbanization. There was a positive relationship between the collision mortality and building size, and that was greatest at large buildings in areas of low urbanization. So that's somewhat surprising, and I think that most people would think that more birds are going to be impacted in urbanized areas than there are in rural areas. This particular study showed that was not the case, that if you took the same size building and put it in a rural area, that there would be more bird collisions at that than they would occur if that building was in the urban environment.
So were the researchers able to pin down why that was?
Well, they had some suggestions that it's related to habitat and bird behavior. Perhaps some of that is learned behavior. Birds are often trying to avoid some of those threatening things in their environment, including windows. And perhaps in some locations they're getting more used to those things in the environment than they are in a more of a rural environment.
Interesting results. What can be done, though, in general, to minimize bird collisions into windows? It's a rather difficult problem to address, isn't it?
Well, it's a difficult problem to address in a cost-effective manner, but it can be addressed. Some of the simple things that have been promoted is just simply reduce the amount of lights that's on, particularly left on overnight in some of the urban environments in the larger structures. So that's one thing that can be done. On smaller scales, smaller buildings, there is some thought that you can put up a different type of glass that is more opaque but still allow adequate light to come through. And perhaps window tinting will also be developed to reduce that bird collision rate. Keep in mind that it's going to be fairly expensive to retrofit some of these buildings, but we still have opportunity for new construction to implement some of those types of ideas, and we can certainly take some measures that's going to prevent these high-risk situations by minimizing the amount of reflective glass that's out there in the environment.
Bottom line, it will be difficult to make a big dent in this problem, though. Isn't that fair to say?
Yes, I don't see us completely eliminating these bird window collisions, but keep in mind that if we're losing 1 billion birds a year, that's a pretty significant number. We often get concerned about some of the things like pesticides do when we find just a few birds a year, and we ignore some of the bigger problems like windows that may certainly be impacting higher numbers of birds than some of the other problems that we must deal with in the environment.
This study again indicates that the makeup of certain buildings can in fact contribute to bird losses in window collisions. Charlie, thanks for a look at this work today. He's a wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. That concludes our Tuesday edition. Thanks to you for being along with us. And please rejoin us here tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.